Okay, hey, train your plants every day. Jordan Scoville coming at you from the STEM lab. Now, one of those things a lot with this material is you might have to go back and use my reference for the resume for psychology, because it is a group stay here, in physics or physics and psychology, depending on which way down the rabbit hole you more like to build that system. But there is a state in the middle of all of that you really can't have until you have psychology or you have physics. But it's one of those things you can't have physics without psychology. A real special relativity notation for it. Those would be the math equations, the real sets. And you can't really have psychology until you have real physics to kind of base your analyzations off of, real points. But again, what this is, from a video this morning, we're going to do this. You can't measure the wave function because the particles break down and you're actually putting high energy waves or high energy fields inside of them. Okay, what happens if particles pop out? So you can't really measure them right, and the particles become wave functions essentially. We'll get into all that later. But it's actually a thesis for Parapsychology Quantum Physics. And I know I ain't no better than the rest of them, just packing it on here. But the reality is to truly understand what this is, we're going to need to build some states for it. Alright, and what I like to do is actually build my bases off of the zero state. When you think about psychology, a lot of times you start here. But the problem with this, and again with a lot of psychology, or a lot of physics, is they'll tell you that to really understand that you got to know where zero is. You got to know where the first calculation is, you got to know where the second calculations are, the third, and so on. Okay, so when I was spending some time in Delhi there, I had a lot of time to just process some information, read some books on psychology, take what I already knew about readings in psychology, and actually apply them. And again, some of my fundamentals are the introduction to psychology, Army survival guides, psychology, and I base that into taking the readings of that, and I've already kind of reworked it into a mechanical survival, because just real quickly, look at a normal person, a normal everyday society. This is a survival. We don't do that to go so far one way or the other on the anthrope. When you're in a survival situation, you want to build this into a set of normalcy, understanding the environment around you, survey, utilize your resources, and base that in a form that is not given by orders, but what's in front of you is going to dictate what you have to do, like law of the universe, essentially. Again, it gets a little weird with the quantum behavior of those particles and those waves that define group states that have a lot going on in between them, and when you put enough pressure on it in high energy fields, smaller fields pop out, smaller wave functions, and that wave function has points. When you look at that point for a second, it changes and has a bunch of points inside of it, just like a person, just like human nature and things like that. So again, one of the first fundamentals, you're going to have to understand the Big Bang. And this is not necessarily a mathematical statement, this is a human nature statement. Remember, this is parapsychology quantum physics. It's going to help psychologists understand an analyzation process and a mechanics process of building and creation being the same thing. Fixing is creating under the same standard of looking at it like a wave and a particle. You start to look at it, you realize there's more going on down there than just the reality. And just like quantum physics today, now they're saying there's stuff that's smaller than the boson. Go ahead, don't believe me? I'll give you some time. Check it out on Facebook. Alright, go. Things smaller than the boson. Those are the things you'll find today, and they're looking. It's a cluster. So, actually, for my thesis, what I like to begin with is the concept of a seventh dimension calculation, essentially. Now, I used to begin with the fifth dimensional calculation, and it certainly works. But the mathematics of the group state doesn't directly apply. Alright, so looking at it top to bottom, because it does still apply to Newtonian order, we're going to look at the human condition from birth. And then we're going to build to looking at that state from here, potentially with the fifth or a seventh dimensional calculation. You have a zero state. Preemie babies that can live, but there will always be some level of a physical condition, whether physical development of the brain, which will cause certain states of matter when you get older stages, which, we're talking, autism potentially. Again, that'll group state into other things later. And a lot of mental disorders, just physical developmental ideas that'll look like a lot of other principles later. But definitely is the principle that, given the human condition on the average, no child below a certain age is going to survive without some level of conditional environmental systems. And again, this could mean that this child, even though it will average out, will take much longer in the system, if that is the average, because that's a physical condition that I have to then mechanically work out by introducing origin or consistency and general the weighing of this resistance, order, and I can't remember the word right offhand here. But then you got very preemie, kids that can average out at the same speed as a normal kid. Very preemie. So you got extremely preemie, definitely going to have some physical problems. Very preemie, preemie in general, which are at this average level of 9 months, later than 9 months by the average that we understand, much later than 9 months, which still may normal out, and then a level after that point where there's going to be some kind of conditional difference about that standard equal to the full inthrope of the original 5, the inthrope that normalizes those first 3, because you're going to go normal, extreme, or preemie, extremely preemie, or very preemie, and extremely preemie as your average measuring stick, which would give you 7 inthropes. 1, 2, extreme, very, preemie, normal. So you're going to have 3 over that system. Again, preemie and over, again, the still average that we base this, it's not actually 9 months to the day that determines what a fully developed person are. There are a lot of conditional things in the parent and things like that that are going to base our first analyzations to determine certain group states that come off physically, because we can't determine a lot of physics from this end of it. We're going to start with those conditions. Now the reality on this is, you have to make milestones. And what those milestones are terms. They're basically wave functions on time systems. We're going to say the first one is crawl. Well, you could say coo, you could say feed on their own, but that's much later actually in the series of events. Babies don't usually feed themselves for a very long time. The 1-year-old kid will starve to death pretty easily. You have to be sensible about when they're going to start moving around. Now, a lot of this material after that point, as a psychologist, when you start to determine, all right, I've performed a case study, is firstly, this happens on a very odd timeline, right? I can't just choose, y'all get pregnant today, and just hope for my best results. I kind of look at the hospitals as many as I can, and then I base that system after that. But once I've recognized you as a case group, every parent beyond that system, and again, every one of their home lives is very different. I don't say, hey, come over here to this clean white lab and raise your kid, and every day you change their diaper 10 times a day whether they need it or not. They're on this very specific regimen from extremely preemie to extremely over the average of relative growth, but that's what they have to do. They all have to stay on that regimen. Now obviously very preemie kids and a kid that's born on 9 months don't need to live in an incubator, so it's going to space those out. But the reality is some kid in an incubator later on in the series of life, because of some averages in this world, can very easily average out in their high school grades and their systems and what have you. However, there are some conditions to those things. Now we're looking at that a little differently. Is home life a factor here? We're starting to add up different particles and systems that have order and regimen inside of them. But you're basically generalizing for those parents a very specific model of what those kids do. And we look at that as, say, child psychology. You want these terms in this order to basically fit your home life, whatever the reality of what that is. Because remember, these particles, by what their names are actually wave functions. As soon as you start to look at it, that particle, it's going to turn into a wave function. As soon as you look at that wave function, it's going to have points, particles. And we have to determine what those real numbers are, because here they're just generalized out to a point, and you have to fill in the real number, which actually turns into how much you make that year, that month, that week, what kind of food your system is, your religion, economics, a lot of things go into that. Not that they make too much of a difference when you do look at it from the other side of it, but you have to use direct physics with it. And it's not necessarily applied physics, it's not quantum physics, it's not classical mechanics or classical physics. We're using direct physics. We're using the parts in front of us and we're applying them with classical mechanics, classical physics, to determine them by group states, forces, resistances against the total average, which is quantum mechanics, which is both those sides. They can both be classical in the standard, but only when relative, when we're looking at them directly, would they be both simultaneously. And we have to be able to understand that from this very large spectrum of seventh dimension or a fifth dimensional calculation. Lorenzo's transformation, essentially, because that's when they're starting to turn. Now we have to develop that and to say how many group states are really out there. What is the physical conditions, and obviously autism. Kids can be ADD. Kids can be anxious. Not very often do you find kids that are super depressed. Usually there's some very physical situations in this world that would lead to that kind of level of depression. Now, when you're out there a little bit older and we realize that social groups are what we are, and we base that number off of those averages, and we understand that we agree with the general composition of what that is, and we're making our system, our liberal system, our freedoms and things like that make sense to those rules. Our particles that add up into the wave function that overlap into this and don't extend beyond those borders make sense to these kind of calculations. This takes a great understanding. First, the analyzation process that'll help you build what bipolar looks like. Attitude adjustments. Again, they start with that home life and those parents. What does that look like? By social liberty of those parents, as much as the idea of physical conditions. We're talking about seasonal changes against the average across the people and a bunch of other things that's going to separate that into a group as much as 0 to 60. But that could be aggression problems. That could be very normal standards of what human nature truly is. Where we would use direct physics, the applied model of looking at their home life and helping them mechanically situate those, change the names of those terms, because we're going to be looking at them. And like Max Planck said, this is a spectrum problem. We're going to start looking at those things. When you start looking at them, they're going to change. They're going to have more group states that's inside them, more calculations and things like that about them, around them, in them, out them, passing through, a bunch of other stuff. And we got to be able to apply that stuff. In psychology, we don't have a lot of time, so we use a little bit of that time to first, from this side, older, to start to get to used to know you, to start to build this group state of just physical points that are in the quantum physics realm. We're talking about things about your life, things about your social behaviors and all kinds of other things before we can really start to determine, hey, I'm going to build a little marshmallow trap and see how anxious you are. Or maybe you're just hungry. If you're just hungry all the time, it's going to make you pretty anxious when food's around. I got to be able to separate those things. So it's going to help us start to build anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, conditional OCD, and a lot of other states, as much as real physical conditions that relate to a medical diagnosis, where we're talking chemistry. We're talking a bunch of other terms and things like that that's going to help you not necessarily build a thesis, but a direct physics model to help you help somebody. To help you trap the rabbit, essentially. And that's a quantum physics statement. So once you understand that, now you're out here to this older person. We're looking for these spectrum problems. We're looking for, I got all these terms out there, and I'm going to start doing little rabbit traps with you to start to group state enough of a thing to understand, whether it's a physical condition, a certain medication, treatment is a pill, essentially, just coming in to visit people, your psychologist, where you may not have been getting that for. That is essential to this chemical reaction that can't really be separated from this variable, what you may be looking at. So these are just some general ideas, and I know I'm going to be building it here soon. It doesn't take too long for me to crack something like that out, but I wanted some of the notation under that concept to be put out there. Catch you on the next one.